Welcome to the 3:15 p.m. session on day 2 of Yard Summit. Next up is Building Faster Websites Faster with JAMstack, and it's presented by Jim Fisk.
Okay, thank you, Aubrey. So yeah, this is the Building Faster Websites Faster. It's a cheeky little name. Basically, the concept here is both having the ability to design and build websites with less effort and making that process quicker, but also having the actual website that's created at the end of the day be a fast performing website. And we're going to talk about the JAMstack paradigm for building websites and how that makes all this possible. So hello, my name is Jim Fisk, and I work at a company called Janku that does a lot of web design and development services, do a lot of content management system work, but also do some JAMstack work these days. And I'm an organizer of the Boston JAMstack meetup. So I've had the pleasure of seeing a lot of interesting folks come through out in Boston and present different ideas. So I like to just pick things that I've learned from them and kind of cobble together and pretend like I'm coming up with some of these concepts. And if you want to follow me on anything, I'm Jim A. Fisk across the board on most things like Twitter and YouTube. So feel free to reach out to me on those platforms. Okay, so before we hop too far into the JAMstack, we should kind of get a basis of meaning here. So what is the meaning of JAMstack? So JAM is an acronym for JavaScript, APIs, and Markup. And those are the fundamental building blocks for this technology. So it's not about specific technologies as much as it is about the paradigm for building websites using these tools. So basically, in order to make it a JAMstack website, there's no server-side processing. So that means no PHP to worry about, no Node.js or Ruby or those types of server-side languages that you're really worrying about on the actual hosted application. And then everything that we're building here is using build time rendering. So essentially, instead of someone going to your website and looking at a page and then that web request basically doing a bunch of logic and then returning something to them, all that is already done ahead of time. So basically you compile all these things before you actually deploy anything. And then what people are getting served up when they actually come and visit your website is the deployed version of the site, which is basically just static files. And so basically what that's doing is it's taking a data source, which could be like something simple like a markdown file, and it's taking a template, which could be, HTML or it could be React or something like that. And it's combining those and then creating those static assets before it's coming to the user. So we've been doing JAMstack stuff for a while. We've had the JAMstack Boston meetup for a couple of years going, although we've had some hiatuses during that period. And without really doing any promotion, we don't advertise or anything like that. We've grown the meetup to over 1,000 members. So I think we're at 1,020 as of today. So the meetup's growing and people are interested in this technology. And we still find that lots of people that come to the meetup don't actually really know what the technology is or how to use it, but they've been hearing it a lot and they hear vague things about this, this stack, and they're interested in learning and why people say it's so great and revolutionary and easy to use and fast and secure and all these different things. So hopefully we can clear up some of that stuff on this talk, like why people are talking about so much, and then just go through the current status of where things are today and where we think they're going. So our agenda today, we're going to break it into 3 main sections. There's going to be the good, there's going to be the bad, which is like the downsides, and then the future, where we think things are going or what we think is going the right direction and where we can expand upon different things. Now, you can probably infer by these titles that this is a little bit of an opinionated talk. So I try to be objective, but I definitely have inserted some of my own thoughts and opinions in this. So definitely take what I say with a grain of salt and form your own opinions, but I'll at least come at this from my perspective. And I definitely have had a history of changing those things over time. So this is what I think today, but maybe they'll change in the future as I learn a little bit more and talk with more people and discover more things. But let's approach it with that lens. Okay, so let's start with the good. The good, one of the best parts about the JAMstack paradigm, I think, is simplicity. So it's this idea of getting back to basics. And the way I can really illustrate that is just by saying the statement that web design is back. So I think we've had a trend with a lot of frameworks where you can't really be a designer anymore and be productive. So even front-end developers are kind of moving more and more into the engineering role, at least in my opinion. So I do a lot of Drupal work, which Drupal is a great framework, but to be a front-end designer in Drupal, you have to be pretty well versed with a couple of different concepts. So in order to get values out of a database, you often have to know how to pre-process things, and maybe you can push some of those tasks onto your back-end development team, but oftentimes you have to do some of that yourself. And at the very least, you're gonna have to understand how to unpack complex objects and format them on the front end. So there's a lot of what I consider like heavier engineering tasks involved in that. So what JAMstack's allowing you to do is really come with very basic HTML and CSS and so maybe some JavaScript skills, and build products that are actually, you know, enterprise ready and usable. And you can do that with tossing out a bunch of concepts that are really complicated that take probably, you know, 80 to 90% of the effort for enterprise builds using other frameworks. So you don't really have to worry about caching. Caching is a really complicated topic that you don't have to do on the JAMstack. Databases, that's a whole complex area. And obviously there are some distributed databases and things that are moving their way into the JAMstack. So, you know, that's maybe not 100% accurate, but for the most part, you're not worrying about that kind of stuff with basic JAMstack implementations. And then server-side code. So you're cutting all that out of your life and you're really focusing on the design. And no longer are, I think, our designers being pushed into only the like actual design tool aspect. So like creating mock-ups and full res Photoshop documents and things like that. I think designers were getting pushed into that arena, but now you can have that blending, I think, where they're doing some of that design work, but also doing some of the front-end design work without having to be an engineer. So why is this different than how we did things before we created content management systems and all these other frameworks, MVC frameworks like Django and Rails and things like that? And really, you know, we're going back to basics, but we're really not. So continuous integration and continuous delivery has really changed the whole landscape here and made this whole JAMstack idea possible. So previously we had static HTML files. In order to edit those, not only was your content kind of interspersed with your layout, which is confusing and tricky for people. So you have like HTML wrapping your content, which isn't a nice editor experience. But you also had this idea of duplication because everything was a static file. If you want to change something like a menu across many different pages, excuse me, you would have to change that in several different places. So since they were all flat files, you were duplicating a lot of your effort. But what we can do with this whole idea of CI/CD, which is basically this concept of on certain types of changes, we're basically spinning up like a Docker container, and we're running a process to actually compile the site and then deliver it to a host. And it's doing all that just easily being spun up and spun down without having us maintain servers and processes. And it's happened all before the delivery of the site. So we're able to actually combine things in interesting ways where we can pull out menus and things like that into their own places. We can have dynamic editor experiences where we're actually having like front-end CMSs that are talking to a backend that's kicking off this CI/CD process and then delivering the website to users that way. So this has really changed the way that we've been thinking about this static stuff. And it's allowed us to kind of think about this stuff to still have that user experience by taking away the database and the server-side code side of things from the actual server where we're hosting our site. And we also want to think about speed when we're talking about JAMstack, right? So we're getting performance, but we're getting it without all the headaches. So, you know, sometimes people say content management systems, maybe like Drupal or WordPress or Joomla, they're not that performant. It's like, well, they can be, but they take a lot of effort to get them there. So obviously you see them on some of the biggest websites in the world. And the reason is you can definitely make those systems fast, but they require at least several layers of caching. So a typical CMS has these layers. So often there's opcode caching. So this is converting your PHP code into bytecode. APC is a common example that we use in Drupal. And there's database caching. So storing the result of database queries and then reducing the database traffic that way. So you can use memcache for something like that. And then there's the web server reverse proxy way. So this is something like Varnish where you're retrieving pages from virtual memory and you're just serving those up. So essentially all that work that's going through taking information out of the database and putting them into a bunch of templates that they're compiling together and then giving that result to the user, they're just caching that end HTML result and they're just serving that up many, many times to the user until something invalidates the cache. And then, you know, you have cache tags and page caching and all sorts of things to worry about when you're talking about these applications. And that's great. If you have the engineering staff to do that, you can set up those things, but oftentimes the hosting costs for those things are quite expensive. And the engineering talent needed to do those things is a high barrier for most folks. So JAMstack eliminates all that since you're really serving up these static HTML files. So you can do this a lot quicker through JAMstack with a lot less headaches, although there are some trade-offs that we're going to get into in a little bit. The other thing is we're moving everything to the CDN. So the CDN is basically it's called a content delivery network. And essentially what it is, it's just having servers all over the world. So when people try to access your assets, they're getting a request to a server that's near them geographically. And that speeds up some of the time over the wire. So traditionally in a CMS, you might have one server that's doing the majority of the work, that has the database and it's doing the server-side code. And then maybe you have CDNs all over the world for like your static assets, like your CSS, your JavaScript, maybe some images and things like that. But a lot of the work is still coming from a single server. So the JAMstack is putting the whole website into those static assets, and then you can distribute that all over the world, which increases performance. And that's not something that's very hard to do if you're in some other type of framework. Okay, now everyone talks about security. So what are we doing when we're talking about security? We're basically just trying to limit the attack vectors. And since we're building these things statically and we're not worrying about the server side of things, we can definitely limit some of those attack vectors. Now, I have this slide in here, and I'm not trying to be disparaging to other frameworks, but I just want to talk about the differences between these different things and the different ways we can think about this. So in terms of security, this first point here talks about Drupal. And I got this number by looking through the Drupal security Twitter of the last year and just counting up the number of tweets manually. So there was 96, according to my calculation, security patches for Drupal last year. And so on the one hand, I think that's pretty amazing. So we have a dedicated Drupal security team of volunteers, largely, who are going through projects, and they're not only finding potential vulnerabilities, but they're writing the code and fixing it. And all the people have to do that maintain these sites have to take that code and put it into their site. So it's pretty amazing that we have such a dedicated team, and they're putting such a solid effort for, like, this number 96, like, just goes to show how great of a job those people are doing. But the caveat here is I used to maintain a lot of individual, like, small websites that I had for personal uses, and most of them weren't really making any money, and they were just kind of something that I wanted on the internet for hobby projects. And I found myself a couple times on vacation having to update my site because we get security releases coming out every Wednesday. And it was effort that just wasn't warranted by the complexity of my sites. My sites were pretty simple, content-based sites. And I found myself getting kind of frustrated with that paradigm. And I was thinking, well, maybe there's a better way to change how we're doing this so we can offload some of that, that updating process to a different period of time in the life cycle. So it's not happening on the schedule that is being exposed vulnerable sites, and it's happening on my schedule instead. And then there's another number here is a 72. So I got this number from wpwhitesecurity.com, and this was essentially the first link that I found when Googling to make my point here. So I haven't verified these numbers besides looking them up, but there's some numbers out there saying a large number of WordPress installations are essentially vulnerable because people haven't been updating the security updates on their site. Now, I don't think that either of these points are failing of the frameworks that I've identified. I'm not trying to say that WordPress or Drupal are bad. Actually, in some ways, it shows how great these frameworks are. What I'm saying is it's not always the right tool for a lot of people who are using it. So people get put on these, you know, a client often will have a budget for a website. They'll have the budget for the design of it and the build of it, but they won't think about the maintenance at all of it. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the development industry don't communicate the actual cost of ownership of these things because they just want to get a project and they want to get it done. So you have a lot of these things that get built and then they kind of get abandoned, or they're not thought of long-term. And then you get these numbers like this, not the fault of the technology, but more of a fault of the planning of people using it. So what I like about the JAM updates is you can make these trade-offs. You no longer have to make these trade-offs between the security and the money. So it's like, hey, we want to have a secure site, but we don't have the budget to do it. So I'm not advocating a set it and forget it website. I actually think the best websites online usually have dynamic content and they have interactivity and things like that. But the reality is a lot of people just want some kind of presence up there to have some information that can be found online. So you can now set people up with a good conscience to have this site that you have a pretty good probability of being secure in the long term without a lot of maintenance work. So it's not time sensitive. So you can set up this site, and even though things are updating all the time, it's not usually time sensitive to update this. No, that's not 100% true because certain packages on the front end do need to be updated. But for the most part, you can have a pretty good reliability of having a site secure because it's all static files. And then another thing I like about this is you can actually build the updates into your dev time. So there's nothing worse than having continuous security updates roll out that cause a lot of development effort. So like, for instance, a part of your site breaks because of an update they did recently, and you have to spend a lot of effort, and then you have to go to your client and say, hey, I now have to charge you because last week we had an update. And they say, well, I didn't ask for any updates, or I haven't prompted you to do any development. So why am I getting a bill there? And then you have to either get in an interesting situation where you are, one, not doing the updates that you should be doing because you don't want to have those conversations, or two, you're having those awkward conversations with the client because you're trying to keep them or their best interest at heart, and you're trying to do the effort to keep their site updated, but they're not really asking for that stuff. So what I like about the JAMstack approach is, although packages get outdated, and in order to keep your static site generator up to date and all the packages involved in that up to date, you do have to do that, but you're only doing it at times when you're actually being asked to do more work. So oftentimes you can bundle those things together and it's a less awkward conversation. It also fits smaller budgets, so people who do want to do a set it and forget it can actually have a website that in the future will be able to be updated dynamically, but it doesn't have to be in the current time frame. Okay, and then the other thing, you can't really talk about JAMstack without talking about microservices. So microservices is this concept of loosely coupled services. And basically, since the JAMstack doesn't handle the backend, so you can't really do forms or comments or commerce or forums or any of those things, you have to offload those to individual microservices. So the way I like to think about this is you're deciding where you want to have the complexity. Do you want to have the complexity sooner or later? And I like the idea of being able to add services one at a time. So in a JAMstack paradigm, you can add these individual services. They are loosely coupled, so they function independently of each other. And it allows you to create MVPs, or minimum viable products, faster. And that's basically where you identify the critical subset of features that are really important to your project or your client or your organization. And then you build that. And then once that is working and it's been tested and it's all set, then you can add new nice to have features on top of it. And when you have a paradigm of microservices, it makes this process a lot easier. So you can be agile, you can roll something out, you can test it, you can plan for the next thing, and you can be much more agile. Because I find in some of the CMS projects I've done, even though a lot of these things claim to be agile, you end up doing this mix between a waterfall and an agile process, because you have to architect a lot of these things together from the very onset of the project, and you end up making a bigger balloon of what the project has to be right from the beginning, then, instead of going down the path of building out something small and then expanding upon it. You also get the added benefit of these things functioning independently of each other. So for instance, if you have one service that breaks, let's say you have a commenting service on your site and that service goes down, it's likely not going to take down your e-commerce, which is a whole different service that functions independently of it. So that's really nice. You could also oftentimes have a broken service that doesn't impact your uptime at all. So for instance, if you're using a content management system and you're pulling in data from that, and maybe it's translated or whatever, if you're pulling that in at build time, even if that service goes down, oftentimes your front-end website is already built, so that content is already there, and you can fix the problem offline without having all your constituents coming to a broken website in the meantime. You can also mix and match providers. Maybe you like a certain vendor for one specific task, but you don't think they do the other tasks very well. You can actually grab the best vendor for each task and then mix them into the same site that way. So I like the fact that these things can function independently. Okay, so I'm just going to assume that you're sold on this concept. Maybe you're not, but let's pretend. And you're curious how you can get started with some of this. Well, there's plenty of options out there. Here's 8 that I've identified. Definitely check some of these projects out. We're going to focus on 2 of them. We're going to focus on Hugo and Gatsby. And if you want to learn more about them, we actually have a YouTube here at /Janku. And we record all the JAMstack Boston meetups there. So you can go back and refer to those. And we also have a course there of the 20-minute Hugo, which is a segment that we do there, which is basically breaks down learning the Hugo static site generator into little 20-minute segments. So if you're interested in getting a first look at that, go check out those videos. Okay, so Hugo versus Gatsby. When you look into this debate, you're going to find that both of these frameworks, and they're not the only ones out there, but they're claiming to be very, very fast. Well, it's like, well, which one's really fast? I'm not sure what's going on here. Are they both fast? Is one faster than the other? And I would say that they're both fast in different ways. So Hugo is very fast on the back end building the sites, and Gatsby's very fast on the front end displaying the sites. And those things are 2 different concepts. Let's hop into those a little bit. Let's start with Hugo and the benefits. So Hugo has very fast builds. And what that means is it's taking that process of compiling the static assets. So it's doing things like taking your markdown files and putting those as variables into your templates in creating static HTML files. And it's like building any of your asset pipeline and everything like that. And it can build thousands or tens of thousands of pages in fractions of the time that other frameworks would take. So it's one of the fastest out there. There are some competitors now that claim to be as fast as Hugo, but it is definitely one of the fastest frameworks. And it's like on an order of magnitude when you compare it to other frameworks like Jekyll or Gatsby, and it can build many, many more assets in that same period of time. I also think one of the benefits is it has a very simple project structure. So it's more along the lines of simple templates and markdown files, and a lot of that is set up for you out of the box, which is nice. I also like that it's actually a simple binary that is the program. So you can just basically download the binary for your operating system. I use a Linux computer, so I get an Ubuntu binary, but you can get one for Mac or Windows. And then basically that's all you need to run the program, which is nice. It has an asset pipeline built in, which I love. So that does things like concatenating your JavaScript files together, your CSS files together. It minifies them so that it runs faster in your browser. And then it'll fingerprint them so you can cache better in the browser and then break your cache when you want to make updates. It has a lot of nice features built in like drafts, redirects, and pagination if you want to get into more deep features. Well, let's compare that with Gatsby. So Gatsby is different. So Gatsby is really fast on the front end. And the way that it does that is it hydrates your app into a single page application. And what that basically means, if you're not familiar with SPAs, it's basically having everything run on the client side. So when you go to new pages, it's not doing a complete browser refresh where it's going and fetching everything from the server. It's just actually running all client side. It accomplishes this in a fast way, but it does code splitting and link prefetching. So basically, by default, I think it code splits on the different page routes. And then when you, so basically, instead of hydrating that whole app and loading your whole app initially, it'll load what you need for that page. And then as you hover over links going to different pages, it starts already fetching the data that's needed for those subsequent pages. So it makes that reloading really fast because you're not actually going back and pulling those assets fresh from the server. You're really just getting that whole page loaded up front. It also has fallback for HTML in case you don't have JavaScript enabled, which is really cool. And then one of the big benefits is it's kind of being positioned as a content mesh. And the way it does that is with this huge ecosystem of plugins. So basically, it can pull from many different data sources. So for instance, maybe you want to pull something from WordPress or Drupal, or maybe you want to pull it from Salesforce or some other service. And you can, there's plugins that are already designed to pull that information from those services. And then it puts it into one standardized interface, which is GraphQL. And then your front-end developers can work from the same type of querying using GraphQL instead of pulling from all these different data sources with different APIs and intricacies. So it makes all your front-end designers speak the same language. And that content mesh concept is really powerful. And I think that's why Gatsby, one of the reasons why Gatsby is so popular these days. I think it's also nice that it enforces component-based design because React is kind of designed that way out of the box. And it has nice features like image optimization. So it'll load like a low resolution, fast loading image to kind of be a placeholder until your faster assets load, and then you get your high resolution stuff, which is pretty nice. Okay, so we've talked about the good, and I know I'm starting to get lower on time. Let's hop into the bad and try to look through some of this. So microservices. Now, I put this in the good column earlier, so why am I saying that this is a bad thing now? Well, microservices have the tendency to get fractured if you put too many of them into them. So for instance, a complex project might have many, many microservices. And the challenge of managing all these microservices independent, I think at a certain point reaches a tipping point where it becomes harder to do it that way than it does to do it in a monolith. And what I mean is a simple example here. So for instance, if you have, let's say, 6 different services, you have comments, commerce, your CMS, then some other ones I'm not going to name off the top of my head. If you have a user that wants to log in and manage these, they potentially have many different logins that they have to do across services. And that can become untenable pretty quickly. So without tying those together in a meaningful way, that can be a pretty fractured experience for a user, especially a non-technical user. It's a big ask. Another thing is your developers are now having to understand the nuances of many different APIs. You know, APIs sometimes update and they break, and you have to know how to fix those. And you have to keep tabs on release schedules from different companies all over the place. So this can become fractured quite fast and can be a frustrating experience if you're not careful with it. Another thing is, well, we're now wondering like, who's answering to whom, right? Like who's owning this stuff? So you can say like, well, I bought a product, so they have to answer me, or bought a service, they're answering to me. It's like, well, at a certain point, you know, you're really kind of answering to them, because if you're using a bunch of proprietary platforms, worst case scenario, you're very successful and you've built out a lot of products based on, or a lot of your website based on someone else's product and say they change their pricing structure, well, and that's unacceptable to you, then you're kind of at the mercy of them, because rewriting all the stuff that you've built off somebody else's platform is always a big undertaking. So you have to make those decisions at a certain point, possibly. Also, you don't have any control, so you lose control over what's being rolled out. Maybe they're rolling out new features you don't like, or they're taking away features you love. That's always a challenge. And you're really reliant on these third parties instead of having more control over your own experience. Of course, you can manage your own microservices. There's no reason that you have to buy somebody else's microservices. So it's all about how you want to set up this product. It just comes down to how much can you manage in-house versus how much should you sub out? What's the core competency of your business and what do you want to manage? And at what point do you say we're giving too much control to third parties? Okay, what about functionality? Are there limitations to the Jamstack? Yes, there are. So I made a matrix here that I think outlines some high-level limitations. There's more than this. And also, I just want to note out that most of these things on this table actually are possible in the Jamstack, and I've seen them implemented on a couple different places, but they're not always easy. And I think in order to make a fair comparison here, we talk about all the shortcomings of CMSs, and even though CMSs can overcome a lot of those, I'd say, well, they're not easy. Then I think it's also a valid argument to say, even though Jamstack can overcome these things, they're not easy. So authentication has some challenges. Having many concurrent editors is tough. Anything that involves saving user information or storing preferences is going to be a challenge. Dynamic roles and permissions, like you're not going to get a nice roles and permission matrix like you're going to get in something like Drupal that you can just click around very easily. Site building, I think, has its challenges. So if you wanted to build like a UI site builder, which I've actually, I have some opinions on the integration of site builders in with websites. And I tend to think that oftentimes there's more drawbacks to integrating site builders than there are benefits. I think oftentimes it makes the developer's life more challenging because they have to carry around some of the baggage that comes along with a site builder instead of just using the tools that they would normally want to use, or at least having to accommodate those. And then oftentimes in enterprise environments, we don't allow end users or clients to use the site builder functionality. So we lock them out of it, but they still have to carry around some of the interface that is like, well, they want to manage content, but now they have some interface that's half content and half configuration type thing. So I think there's some challenges to site builders in general, but assuming you want to build one into it, I think, designing layouts through the UI is going to be extremely challenging. Content modeling is going to be extremely challenging, and building reports and lists. And these things are very trivial in other solutions like WordPress and Drupal. Now, content, I think content works pretty well in Jamstack on certain scales, but if you have a large number of pages and you're not using something that compiles very fast like Hugo, your compilation time is going to be very slow. And those delays can add up pretty quickly, especially when you get in the thousands of pages. Also, frequent updates. So if you have many content editors updating things frequently, you're going to be building all the time, and that has some challenges as well. You're also not going to get tools, for the most part. I mean, some solutions probably offer this, but like image croppers, entity references, nice tools like that through the UI, you're probably not going to have those out of the box for the most part. And then moderation workflows. I'm talking like when you're creating new content, having drafts and needs review and things like that. Now, that's obviously not entirely true. The Netlify CMS, which is a React-based front end, has some moderation tools that work pretty unique on the back end, where they actually create pull requests as drafts, and then you can pull them in when you publish them. But for the most part, this stuff becomes a lot more challenging, and you're probably not going to have the robustness you have through another solution. And of course, there's community challenge like membership renewals, messaging forums, and private content. That's all challenging in the Jamstack. So when we talk about challenges, let's look at Hugo versus Gatsby here. And then I'll try to open up for questions in just a minute here. So I think some of the challenges in Hugo are, there's lots of convention. Now I think convention can be a good thing. So this could easily go in a positive column, but there's things like you have to understand how templates inherit from each other. So themes, can be put into Hugo, and then you have to know what can override those templates and how that inheritance structure works. You have to understand the difference between single and list templates and when those are being used. Now, a lot of these things are great concepts, but they take a lot of understanding Hugo's way of doing things before you can get used to them. Another thing I think is a challenge is that they use Go templates on the front end, so that can feel unnatural for people who aren't familiar with Go. Like things like for loops become ranges, the scoping becomes like a dot notation that's might be kind of confusing to people. Now, I do some Go development, and I actually like a lot of the syntax, but if you're not familiar, I could see it as a barrier. Also, you don't have some of the front-end tools like the JavaScript single-page application stuff, which has some limitations for speed and also component-based design. Hugo's not going to force you to do component-based design by default, even though I do it with most of my projects. It also can't be easily extended because of the nature of the fact that it's a single binary that's produced and it's not using those build tools. Now, I love the simplicity of that, but if you want to do things like pull from many data sources, you're going to have at least some challenges there in order to implement something like that. And the Gatsby challenges, the build times comparatively to Hugo are much, much slower. And I'm talking for even several or dozens of pages, it's a much slower experience. Now, Gatsby had some proprietary projects that they're using to help solve some of this. So they have like progressive builds and previews and things like that. But the thing you're getting out of the box in terms of the open source project, you're going to have some challenges there. There's also a lot of setup that's required to pull from different data sources. So for instance, if you want to even pull from a simple markdown file, you have to add some plugins there, and then you have to set up the page routes for those different files. And then you have to query you have to know something about GraphQL to actually query that data source and pull those nodes out and use them in your template. So there's some challenges. And then I think React can actually be kind of difficult for beginners, even though it's one of the most popular frameworks out there on the front end. And actually, this could easily be a benefit as well, because a lot of people do know React. But I think you know, some projects can get quite complicated quite quick if you're not familiar with the way that React sets up things. Okay, so quickly going into the future here. I think one of the things that's needed for the future is a stronger open source microservices ecosystem. So Netlify, this is a screenshot from their website. They've released several microservices all the way from a Go-based commerce solution to a front-end React CMS, and then some login authentication services. So people are building these things out, and there's other organizations besides Netlify that are contributing to this ecosystem. But I think really having more people understand and use these things, making documentation, maybe making YouTube videos around them, using them in real projects and contributing to them. I think we have a long way to go still, even though we've gone a tremendous amount of distance in just a few short years. And I think the companies that are contributing to these things are doing an amazing job. So I think we should definitely give them a hand. But I think this is a huge part to JAMstack adoption, is having these open source microservices really reach a level of maturity. I also think the CMS market expanding is going to be a big part. So hobbyists and technology facing people are happy using static site generators and command line tools, but building out these JAMstack CMSs is going to be the next frontier, I think. So there's a couple of paradigms when you're talking about JAMstack CMSs. There's a Git-based ones, and there's the API-based ones. So for Git, the popular ones right now are Tina and Netlify CMS. And for the API, there's tons of these, but I just picked two open source ones, Strappy and Ghost. Now, I haven't actually used these too extensively. I've seen some demos of Strappy and Ghost, and they seem really promising. But there's two different ways of thinking about it. So these are kind of separate applications that basically expose an API, whether that's like a GraphQL endpoint or maybe it's a JSON API. And then the git-backed one, these are basically making commits to your repository, and then they're rebuilding through CI that way. So I'm particularly interested in the git-backed because I think this has a nice integration with your static site generator. There's a close coupling to that. And I think there's some really powerful things you can do with that. So I have a couple slides of quotes here just to demonstrate what I'm talking about. So this is taken from Netlify's O'Reilly book that they have online for free. It's a PDF that you can grab. And it says, a saved change in the CMS, and they're talking about their Netlify CMS, which is that React application. Saved change in the CMS is really made as a Git contribution behind the scenes. That's powerful in that developers and editors are working in the same Git-based workstream, modifying the same files using whichever method is most comfortable to them. And so that's really powerful. You get your developers and your content people speaking the same language, even though they're not necessarily familiar or aware of the fact that they're doing that. So developers can use their tools that they're normally using. That's maybe VS Code, maybe it's Git, GitHub, things like that. And then the content editors, they're just editing forms on the website like they normally would do in a CMS, and that's saving to Git as well. And that makes it really easy for people to integrate and see what each other are doing, especially on the back end. Let me just do one more quote here. In the JAMstack, it's possible and common for the content of the site, blog posts, and all to live in a Git repository along with the code and the templates. This means that no content database is required, making JAMstack sites dramatically easier to set, run, deploy, branch, and modify. And in this version control-centric world of the JAMstack, every deploy in the site is atomic, making it trivial to roll back to any state at any time for any reason. Now, I've met some people that really hate the idea of putting their content in their code repository along with it. I personally really like that process. I like it for the fact that I've had situations, many in the past, where a client will accidentally delete a page, and often that's due to my own blunder of not setting permissions properly by forcing people to only unpublish a page. I let people delete it. But recovering a page that's been deleted can be quite difficult. Sometimes it requires restoring a SQL database. Sometimes it requires restoring a whole server snapshot. Then you have to query through, you have to find that information, sometimes recreate the page manually. Now, if things are all through the common language of Git, I can just open up my Git history. I can easily revert a commit. I can see what's done there. And it's a very comfortable paradigm for me. So I really love the idea of the git-backed CMS. And now site building, I think, we talked about what I think the limitations of site building are in the previous slide. So I'm not going to go too deep into that. But we have to understand, like, what are the important parts to integrate here? Maybe it's not a site builder, but lowering the barriers for non-technical users, I think, is important. So the idea of aggregating and integrating microservices, I think certain services are doing this. Like StackBit has a great solution where they're letting you pick the static site generator, letting you pick the theme, and they let you pick some of the tools, and they're pulling them all together for you. I think something like this needs to happen. Netlify does a great job of this as well, bringing forms and things like that and deployments of your site all under one hood. The more we see this happening and bring these things together in a cohesive way, I think that's going to be really the future for some of this Jamstack stuff. And then making the right things configurable. Now, I promise this is my last content slide. I think I'm out of time or way over it. This is where I think the potential is, and this is where I want to spend some of the effort, my own development efforts in the future, and hopefully people will be smarter than me, will work on some of this stuff as well. But the idea of more tightly integrating your git-backed CMS into your static site generator, I think would have a lot of advantages. Like right now, if you want to do something in like Netlify CMS, oftentimes your content modeling, so if it's done in Hugo with something like your archetypes, will have to be kind of recreated in your Netlify CMS. And I would love if those things were fed off all the same information. I think there'd be huge advantages there. Fast compilation times would obviously be needed for a git-backed CMS solution to feel like it's real-time updates. And then having a CMS built with the same front-end framework that's using the templates would be powerful. So right now, if you had a Hugo site with a Netlify CMS, for instance, your Hugo front-end is built with Go templates, but your Netlify CMS is built with React. So if you wanted live previews to actually know what components you're adding to the page, you oftentimes would have to recreate those components in React, even though they've already been built with a Go template. Now, I feel like that's a lot of duplication of work, and I would love to see some sharing among those templates used with the CMS and used on the front end of the website. I also think limiting your dependencies is a good paradigm. So not having lots of things they have to build in there. I love simplicity, although it has challenges like we talked about. And also component-based design is important to me because I think that's the future and the present of design. It allows you to scope things easier and reuse things across the site. So that is where we're at. I think I've blown over time. I apologize for going a little bit over. I know I talk fast. I was trying to get as much in as I could to provide value, but if people have thoughts or complaints or completely disagree with me, please let me know and I'd be happy to answer them. If not now, because we have to set up for other speakers, then somewhere else online. So thanks for listening. This is where you can find me if you're interested in finding out more or talking about this stuff.
Yeah, you have 8 minutes anyway, and there's not another speaker in this room after you. So yeah, if you have a lot of questions, don't worry about going over because yeah, there's no one else after this.
Okay, great. So I'm looking in the chat. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. So I think we're, I would love to see the workflow or setup. So Sharon said, I would love to see the workflow or setup. So I'm wondering if that's referring to kind of what I was saying might be the future, or if that's referring to a specific static site generator or a CMS. So Sharon is used to the CMS and the static sites, okay. And is maybe curious about how I'm using some of this stuff.
Can I just talk instead?
Yeah, do it, please.
Okay, so I'm starting to, like, I did generate a Gatsby site, but I haven't had time to go and do more. And I don't learn until I'm in it. I see it, I do it. I'm just curious as how you would get a CMS and a static site. So let's say Gatsby and like Contentful, whatever, Contentful, one of those, Netfly. I would just love to see like the UI and how people enter content and everything.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not making much sense.
No, I think you are. So you're trying to understand like what that might actually look like in practice, what that
Yeah.
content manager. Okay.
Do you
Yeah.
have
So
any kind of demos or setups with your company, or how you take a client through it, perhaps, that you could refer me to?
yeah, I think unfortunately, I have a couple videos that I think might help. So on my personal YouTube channels, that's YouTube/Jim A. Fisk. There are a couple, and they're more developer centric, but it'll give you a sense of the UI. And there's probably better videos than mine, honestly, on mine. But there's a couple about Netlify 5 CMS and setting it up and changing some of it. And basically what it shows is like how you could log into it and what the interface looks like. And essentially what it is when you're on your website, so say like jim.com or whatever, I would do /admin. And then it would pop up with a little login screen. And then I would log in that, and that would actually authenticate to GitHub. And then basically I would get what looks like a CMS, kind of similar to like a WordPress CMS, but although a little bit simpler.
Okay,
And
maybe an interface.
what's that?
Is there an interface? Is that
Yeah, there's an interface, and it would give you an interface, and it would basically show you all the content. So for instance, my examples only had like a couple blog posts and a couple pages, but it'd be like, here are your blog posts, here are your pages. You could click into those and see any of those. And then when you edit it, it would just be like a form. It'd be like, here's your title. You can edit your title like a web form. Here is your body. Here's a date field. Here's the image you uploaded, and you can like do a media selector. So it looks very similar to any CMS that you're used to, although maybe it's a little bit more lightweight, but it definitely has a very similar feel to that.
And then the GitHub part, for example, it's storing everything, the repo. He said it could also have the content in it.
Yep.
Do you deploy from GitHub to the actual servers wherever this lives?
Yeah. And yes, and that's a great point. And so there's a couple of different ways you can deploy. And this is the thing that I hope people are going to make easier and make more services. But basically what's going to happen is, and it depends how you want to do it. So you could have like Travis CI or Circle CI or any of those like continuous integration. Actually, GitHub Actions could do this now.
Yeah.
And GitLab has its own CI runner as well. But basically you could say, every time I commit to this, spin up this continuous integration, which is just like a Docker container, essentially. And then it says, try to build my site, try to run these tests to make sure it works, and then deploy it. And that's the whole concept of atomic deploy. So if that fails at all during that process, then nothing gets deployed. So you don't break your existing site. You don't have a half deployed site or anything like that. It says, make sure this whole bundle gets completely deployed, passes tests and everything like that, and then deploy it all at once. And so every time that I, as a developer, change maybe the HTML or the React, and I send that as Git, it will deploy it. Or anytime a content editor who's editing through the website interface, through the actual like web forms, that actually sends a commit without them knowing. They don't have to know about commits at all. That sends a commit to GitHub as well. And that also queues off a deployment and builds the site and deploys it again.
So no one has to approve that commit from an editor, so to speak, or even from a developer. There's no pulling or forking or anything.
So you can set it up. So that's an optional thing. So you can set up this idea of content moderation where you can set up a draft. So let's say we were working on a project together and we're part of the same organization. Maybe I'm the content manager and you're an editor or something like that. And then you would make a change, and then that would come in what's called a pull request in GitHub. And basically through the interface, it appears as a draft for me. So it looks just like a normal draft, and then I can approve or deny it. And say I approve it, that basically would actually merge that PR into that pull request into your main database. And at that point it would rebuild. So you could have a process where certain people are only allowed to make drafts that aren't publicly available, and other people can actually save and commit code that becomes publicly available.
That's great.
Yeah, and there's one last really cool thing that I think is really interesting. So you can have people outside your organization collaborating as well. And the way that they do that, I forget, they're calling it community authoring or something like that. So basically, I could have a widget on my website that says, anybody can try to edit this web page. And it essentially, and you don't know what's happening, but behind the scenes, when you outside of my organization try to edit it, it creates a fork of the whole project into your personal GitHub repository. It allows you to make a pull request from that. And then I can either, if people are like forking the thing and putting swears or whatever, I could just ignore it. It doesn't have any effect on the site and nobody ever sees it. It never touches our repository at all. But if someone makes a change that really helps our organization out, we can pull it in. And that way we don't have to create logins or anything for these people, but we can benefit from their contributions.
Wow. Thank you for explaining that. You did that very well.
Oh, great. Thank you. Appreciate it. It looks like, so Lucas asked about the recordings, and I think Aubrey or Rick might have put a link in here, so that's great. So you can find all the recordings at youtube.com/Nerd Summit. But it'll take a couple days.
Yeah, I know this morning's sessions are already up on YouTube, but I don't know if this afternoon's will be up later tonight. It's like, it just depends on the person who's like converting them all and all of that. It depends on when they can get to doing the afternoon ones. So it might be later tonight, it might be tomorrow, it might be Monday. So just within the next couple days, they should all be up.
Awesome. Well, I don't see any other questions. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for the question, Sharon. I appreciate that. And yeah, thanks for attending the session, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks.